what's up guys? What actually happens when a Saiyan's insane pride crashes straight into the ruthless hidden sand village? This is gonna be wild.
The Wind Desert had learned one absolute truth over the centuries. Silence isn't peace, it's a warning of something deadly. But on this specific evening, the relentless desert encountered an anomaly that completely defied every known law of chakra. The sunset sky didn't just tear apart. It violently fractured under an unimaginable cosmic pressure from another universe. From the very seams of reality, a lone figure plummeted downward like a devastating projectile fired by the cosmos. He tore through the atmosphere without a shred of resistance, trailing a dark energy that the ninja world had never felt. The sheer velocity of his descent ignited the surrounding air, turning his arrival into an apocalyptic meteor strike. The impact was nothing short of biblical, instantly carving out a massive 60-meter crater in the unforgiving wasteland. The immediate perimeter didn't just scatter. The extreme heat instantly vitrified the sand into sheets of dark, jagged glass. Thick, suffocating smoke billowed from the scorched earth, masking the epicenter of the crash in an eerie, unnatural darkness. A terrifying shockwave violently swept across the dunes, threatening to swallow everything in its destructive, ever-expanding path. The concussive blast reached the heavily fortified walls of Sunagakur like a massive punch of suffocating, superheated air. Ceramic pots shattered on the streets while guard torches violently bent away from the desert, as if fearing the arrival. Instantly, classified alarms that hadn't been heard since the last Great War began shrieking across the entire hidden village. High above the panicked streets, the administrative tower stood silent, housing the only man capable of comprehending this threat. Gaara slowly opened his eyes, having felt the disturbance deep within his core long before the mechanical alarms wailed. It was a ghost sensation from his Shukaku days. A sensitivity to raw, unfiltered power that refused to fade. The sand around his feet subtly shifted, standing at attention like loyal hounds, sensing a predator in the dark.
That isn't chakra. It feels like a thunderstorm pretending to be a campfire.
Back at ground zero, the dense smoke slowly dissipated, revealing a figure completely unbothered by the catastrophic landing. He stood perfectly still, his coal black eyes scanning the alien horizon with a cold, functional disdain for this reality. His white armor remained pristine, his posture radiating the absolute confidence of a warrior who needed no defensive stance. He processed the unknown variables not with confusion or alarm, but with the systematic coldness of a veteran survivor.
What kind of miserable rock is this? Bulma's lab really screwed up this time.
The first wave of Sand Shinobi arrived in absolute silence, employing chakra suppression techniques that would fool any normal human sensor. But to the Prince of all Saiyans, their suppressed chakra felt like ripples of clumsy fish disturbing a perfectly still pond. Yura emerged from the ridgeline, his survival instinct screaming that the man standing below was an unprecedented, cataclysmic threat. The Junin demanded identification, but Vegeta's interest in the interrogation was completely indistinguishable from his interest in a roadside pebble. Without a single word, he raised two fingers, intending to swat them away like bothersome insects invading his personal space. A localized pulse of raw energy erupted, acting as a kinetic sledgehammer that instantly warped the air pressure itself. The elite scouts were swept away like dead leaves in a hurricane, landing in various degrees of undignified chaos. 20 minutes later, a completely different caliber of reinforcement arrived, dropping from the cliffs with calculated, predatory precision. Temari opened her massive fan, a gesture her enemies knew meant the conversation was about to turn incredibly violent. She demanded a justification for the attack, her voice carrying the harsh, unyielding authority of the desert itself. Vegeta simply evaluated her with a cold, functional glance, clinically explaining he was stranded due to a laboratory accident. To call their home a miserable corner of the desert was an insult Kankuro's pride could barely stomach. Suddenly the wind died completely. The air grew heavy, thick with a commanding presence that required absolutely no introduction. Gaara did not walk. He simply materialized, gliding across the desert surface as if the earth itself was presenting him. The Kazakaj arrived without a sound, establishing his authority not with shouts, but with the suffocating weight of his silence. Two pairs of eyes locked, each recognizing the heavy, violent burden of worlds that had previously tried to break them. Gaara descended into the blast zone, the earth continuously shifting like a living carpet, adjusting perfectly to receive its master. The Kazakaj stated the obvious fact. This stranger was not from their world, and the monstrous energy he carried wasn't chakra. The Saiyan Prince confirmed it with brutal honesty, warning that the power within him was far greater than anything they could imagine. In that heavy silence, an unspoken recognition formed, not camaraderie, but the rare acknowledgement of encountering another apex predator. Bypassing territorial pride entirely, Gaara practically calculated the logistics, asking exactly how much time the stranger needed to leave.
Stay in the outer desert. Do not attack my shinobi. If you haven't found your anomaly in 24 hours, we will talk again. Acceptable. Just keep your amateur ninjas with their authority complexes out of my way while I work.
But Kankuro's deeply ingrained shinobi paranoia refused to accept a simple verbal agreement with an entity of such terrifying power. In a fatal miscalculation fueled by professional pride, his glowing chakra threads snapped instantly to life. The deadly puppet Karasu materialized directly behind the alien, its wooden hand extending silently toward his exposed shoulder. The intent wasn't necessarily to kill, but to arrogantly demonstrate that the Sand Village could strike whenever it pleased. Vegeta sensed the pathetic displacement of air before the puppet even finished materializing, and he spun with blinding velocity. It wasn't a calculated block to push the puppet away. It was a perfectly executed strike designed solely to annihilate. The masterpiece Kankuro had spent years perfecting, loaded with hidden blades and deadly poisons, was instantly reduced to useless firewood.
Learn from this, because next time, I promise you, my precision won't leave you breathing.
Did he just one-tap Kankuro's masterpiece without even looking? Do you guys think Kankuro was just doing his ninja duty, or was that straight-up suicidal stupidity?
By the time the scorching morning sun rose, Baki and his hand-picked elite squad arrived to officially assess this walking apocalypse. This wasn't a reckless ambush. It was a highly calculated threat evaluation by the absolute best the Sand Village had to offer. Vegeta hadn't moved an inch. He simply waited, letting them surround him with the calm indifference of an untouchable god. Baki formally demanded a show of his capabilities, warning that failure to comply meant being treated as an unknown hostile.
You want a demonstration of my power? Fine. Try not to blink, you amateurs.
Without any warning, he unleashed his ki. It didn't just grow. It methodically ignited like a forest fire, consuming oxygen. The Super Saiyan Phase 1 exploded into the harsh desert like a second, infinitely more terrifying sunrise. His dark hair flashed pure gold, fundamentally altering the very texture of his presence into something overwhelmingly oppressive. The sheer physical pressure of his aura acted like a solid wall of kinetic force. Effortlessly swatting the elites away, Baki barely managed to anchor his feet with chakra, his eyes wide as he realized their entire threat scale was useless. Unwilling to accept defeat, Kankuro unleashed a completely rebuilt, heavily armored version of his puppet, armed to the teeth. It was an incredible shinobi assault, raining poison needles and toxic gas specifically designed to overwhelm any human target instantly. The prince didn't even flinch. He simply extended his palm, condensing the temperature of a dying star into his hand.
The Gallic gun fired. A towering beam of devastating purple energy violently erased the space between them. The upgraded puppet, the poison clouds, the chakra threads, and 40 meters of sand simply ceased to exist simultaneously. Kankuro stood frozen, holding empty threads of chakra, his professional pride completely shattered by this incomprehensible display of raw power. Recognizing the immediate danger, Temari didn't hesitate. She swooped in from the high ground, unleashing her purest wind technique. The Kamaitachi wasn't just wind, it was heavily compressed air accelerating fast enough to slice solid stone into dust. The cutting gales slammed directly into Vegeta's defensive ki, leaving absolutely nothing but microscopic ripples on his blazing golden aura. However, he wasn't completely invulnerable to concentrated physical force. The sheer volume of the storm forced him one single step backward. That single misstep was all the Kazekage needed. Gaara's brilliant tactical mind instantly calculated the microsecond window of vulnerability. Before Vegeta could fully stabilize his golden aura, the desert itself rose up in a perfectly timed, razor-sharp offensive. This wasn't a blunt attack. It was sand compressed to the density of steel, fired during the exact fraction of a second his defense shifted. It was the transformation window, a microscopic gap in his ki distribution that no normal warrior could ever hope to see, let alone exploit. The dense sand spike completely bypassed his faltering shield, brutally tearing right through his pristine armor and slicing into his flesh. It wasn't a lethal blow, but it was deeply painful, the kind of pain that cuts right through a warrior's untouchable pride.
Transformations have windows of vulnerability. But I know it won't happen twice.
Vegeta stared at the blood. Any other Saiyan would have lost their mind in a blind rage, completely leveling the entire continent. But the prince simply powered down. The golden light vanished, leaving only the cold reality of a warrior who acknowledged a superior tactical strike. Without another word, he turned his back on them and walked deep into the wasteland, possessing the chilling composure of a man determined to fix his only flaw. Miles away from any prying eyes, the Saiyan Prince stopped in the heart of the wasteland, surrounded by the crushing silence of the dunes. The scorching daylight rapidly bled away, replaced by the deep, suffocating blues and purples of an unforgiving, freezing desert night. He looked down at the shallow cut on his arm, a stark physical reminder that his untouchable pride possessed a microscopic, fatal flaw. Instead of raging or unleashing mindless destruction, Vegeta simply closed his eyes, completely abandoning his traditional physical training for absolute stillness. He remained absolutely motionless under the starlight, executing a meditative discipline he had avoided for decades because he deemed it completely unnecessary. He wasn't simply resting, he was actively listening to the internal flow of his own chaotic energy with cold, surgical precision. His ki entered a state of deliberate, continuous flux, circulating entirely within his body like water trapped inside a highly pressurized system. He meticulously mapped his internal patterns, hunting for the exact microsecond his defensive energy weakened to feed the transformation's outward expansion. It was an excruciating process of mental microsurgery, performed in absolute darkness using only his sheer, unyielding willpower as the scalpel.
I absolutely refuse to let a microscopic fraction of a second dictate my limits in this pathetic world.
Throughout the grueling second day, the relentless sun baked the earth, but the warrior remained completely paralyzed in his deep meditative trance. He relentlessly analyzed the gap, realizing the traditional sequence of dropping his guard to redirect power was a massive, exploitable vulnerability. The solution wasn't raw speed, it was a fundamental rewiring of his energy, forcing his aura to overlap rather than sequentially transition. As the second night fell, the chilling wind howled around him, yet his internal focus reached a terrifying, unparalleled level of absolute clarity. He successfully manipulated his internal flow, initiating the explosive expansion of power a fraction of a second before the defensive layer redistributed. By the dawn of the third day, the golden sunlight crested over the horizon, illuminating a warrior who had fundamentally evolved. Vegeta slowly opened his coal-black eyes, the intense irritation gone, replaced entirely by the cold, calculating confidence of a true apex predator. He stood up from the freezing sand, his white armor glowing faintly in the morning light as he prepared to test his theory. He initiated the transformation with agonizing slowness, defying every biological instinct that told a Saiyan to explode violently into their awakened state. The golden aura rose smoothly and continuously like an unstoppable incoming tide, completely eliminating the dangerous spike and the vulnerable window. He stood bathed in golden light for a long moment, verifying that his defensive coverage remained absolutely flawless throughout the entire transition. Having perfectly mastered the basic state, he immediately pushed forward, demanding even more from his newly rewired, highly pressurized energy system. Transitioning to the second phase required an exponentially larger expansion, creating a proportional risk that he forcefully clamped down on with sheer will. Blinding electricity violently shattered the air around him, but the core defensive aura remained completely impenetrable, overlapping seamlessly without a single gap. Vegeta stood fully realized in his ascended state, having used a completely alien world to solve a weakness he never even knew he had. The village saw him coming from miles away. His stabilized golden aura painted the desert sky like a terrifying second sun approaching. Every single sensory array inside the hidden village screamed in absolute panic, recognizing an energy far more concentrated and massive than before. Gaara stood atop the administrative tower, watching the electrified golden meteor descend directly toward his heavily fortified main gates. He landed perfectly. There was no explosion, no crater, just the chilling, absolute control of a warrior who had mastered his own biology. The massive wooden gates slowly creaked open, revealing Temari and the elite guard, cautiously assessing the evolved alien prince. She instantly noticed his arm. The deep, bleeding gash from yesterday was completely healed, leaving only a faint scratch on his armor. He wasn't radiating blind rage anymore. The golden energy flowed around him with the suffocating, flawless tranquility of a deep ocean. Baki's elite squad launched a highly coordinated assault, executing complex sealing jutsu designed to instantly paralyze massive targets. The elites charged diagonally across the battlefield, throwing explosive tags and blinding smoke in a desperate, perfectly unified formation. Vegeta simply walked forward. He didn't smash them, he effortlessly glided through their attacks with microscopic, terrifying precision. He delivered a perfectly calibrated strike to a pressure point, incapacitating the elite ninja without shattering a single bone. It was a beautiful, brutal demonstration. He was systematically dismantling the village's greatest fighters to establish absolute, undeniable dominance. Complex genjutsu traps shattered effortlessly against his pure ki. He moved through the elite formation like a ghost walking through heavy rain. Refusing to back down, Temari unleashed a massive consecutive barrage, turning the desert air into invisible, continuous razor blades. Vegeta walked straight into the howling vortex. His stabilized aura flawlessly deflected the wind pressure without a single microsecond of vulnerability. Blinking right through the violent storm, he materialized instantly in front of Temari, completely bypassing her massive fan's defensive range. He didn't strike her. He gently pressed a single glowing finger against her forehead, freezing the fierce kunoichi right in her tracks.
You're completely out of your depth here, kid. Do yourself a favor and sit down.
Defeated by pure, overwhelming presence rather than violence, Temari slowly dropped to the sand, her face a mix of indignation and awe. Refusing to quit, Kankuro desperately launched a synchronized pincer attack, sending his deadly puppets diagonally to exploit any potential blind spots. Vegeta didn't even turn his head. He smoothly caught the primary puppet by the face, instantly halting its lethal kinetic momentum. Simultaneously, he casually levitated out of harm's way, perfectly dodging the second puppet's underground ambush without breaking a single sweat. He held the fragile weapon delicately, proving to the puppeteer that he could have easily reduced it to sawdust again if he wanted.
I told you I remember what I say. Consider this my precise calculation.
Kankuro stood completely paralyzed. His ingrained shinobi paranoia was finally, utterly replaced by pure, undeniable admiration for the warrior. The chaotic battlefield fell completely silent. The legendary elites were scattered and thoroughly beaten, but miraculously, every single one was still breathing. From the deep shadow of the massive gates, the Kazekage slowly stepped out into the open, rocky terrain. Gaara wasn't holding back anymore. He summoned a colossal sea of sand, perfectly merging his entire consciousness with the absolute limits of his power. Vegeta spread his arms wide, drawing upon an unfathomable well of energy that he had perfectly refined during his absolute isolation. The golden key condensed between his palms, compressing the chaotic pressure of a dying star into a singular, devastating focal point. Gaara analyzed the catastrophic buildup, realizing instantly that this wasn't just a simple blast, it was an extinction-level event. The Kazekage didn't retreat a single inch. He summoned an absolute sea of sand to form a colossal, impenetrable barrier. A perfectly compressed sphere of ultra-dense sand encapsulated Gaara, specifically designed to completely distribute the incoming catastrophic impact.
Final flash!
The towering beam of pure, devastating energy violently erased the space between them, tearing diagonally across the barren desert landscape. It struck the sand sphere not like water hitting a solid rock, but like a raging sun instantly vaporizing a morning mist. The absolute defense fought back bravely, frantically redirecting the overflowing kinetic energy into the surrounding atmosphere in a blinding explosion. But the beam's trajectory was flawlessly calculated, completely vaporizing the terrain while perfectly, intentionally missing the hidden village's walls. Gaara was blown violently backward by the sheer shockwave, using residual sand to beautifully cushion his high-speed, dangerous landing. As the thick smoke finally cleared, a massive, vitrified canyon lay smoking in the desert, completely rewriting the local geography. Having clearly made his point, Vegeta simply powered down, his raging golden aura vanishing into the calm, settling desert dust. Gaara stood up, wiping a small trail of blood from his mouth, staring across the completely devastated, glass-lined battlefield. A heavy, profound silence fell over them, the kind of quiet that only exists after a battle has said absolutely everything. The Kazekage looked at the perfectly intact village walls, immediately realizing the ruthless alien prince had actively protected his people.
There is no glory in destroying something that isn't a threat. Besides, I have people waiting for me back home.
In that brief confession, Gaara saw a reflection of himself, a former monster who ultimately chose the heavy, agonizing burden of protecting. The desert wind blew gently between them, carrying an unspoken, profound mutual respect forged through absolute, unrestrained combat. Suddenly, the sky fractured once again. Bulma had finally managed to forcefully rip open the dimensional tear from the other side. Vegeta turned toward the glowing rift, pausing for just a second to glance back at the young, stoic Desert King. The Saiyan Prince gave a slight, unmistakable nod, the absolute highest form of respect one true warrior could ever grant another. He stepped into the cosmic tear without a word, leaving the Kazekage alone on a battlefield forever changed by his presence.
Wow. What detail do you think showed the ultimate respect between these two absolute legends? Drop your thoughts in the comments right now. That's it for this insane crossover simulation. Absolutely smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next wild scenario. Peace out.